Hi, this is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center for Recovery and the Radical Recovery Summit. I'm really happy to be here today with Kevin Griffin. He's a long-time member and one of the early originators of the Buddhism recovery movement and has several books really interesting in terms of the way that you've taken Buddhism and really worked with it with recovery. And so that's really part of what I'd like to focus on today. So maybe we could start with you just kind of telling us a little bit about you and your work and how you got to this point, and then we'll get into what does it mean to be a Buddhist in recovery and part of this big network.
Yeah, my story is kind of a lot of what I teach in a way.
Mhm.
Uh, at least there are certain aspects of my story. Um, and of course, that's kind of a recovery tradition in any case, telling our story. So I don't keep my personal story out of my teaching. Long before I got sober, I had an interest in spirituality and in meditation um, and got fairly serious about that, uh, uh, particularly about Buddhist meditation. Started going on retreats, and while there was a certain sort of uh, you know s- helpful and meaningful aspect of that, there was also an aspect of that was sort of diluted in its own way, kind of
Mhm.
trying to use spirituality as an escape, thinking that I was going to be magically cured of my problems as I perceived them, which
Right.
didn't really include drug addiction and alcoholism. That wasn't really the problem in my mind. I figured that would all take care of itself once I had some spiritual, mind blowing experience.
Mhm.
So, consequently, that kind of wound up being, in certain ways, a dead end. I mean, I became a good meditator, but that didn't really change anything else in my life. That is,
Yeah.
I became skilled at meditating. Saying good at meditation is sort of not sure that's a good term to even use. So, through this kind of a churning of sort of mixture of spiritual journey and addictive behavior. And I was a musician, so I sort of didn't have any grounding in my life, like relationships and work and, everything was sort of uh, disconnected. So when I got sober, I was 35, which is half my age now.
Ah,
Um, I I kind of had to start again with my Buddhist practice in a way,
mm,
and really I got sober, and as happens, I realized, oh, I had this all wrong. I
yeah,
had,
yeah.
I had life all wrong,
Mhm.
and restarted my life, and I had dropped out of high school. You know, I came from a very educated family. My father was a lawyer, brothers went to very good schools, but part of my rebellion was, oh, I don't need all this. I'm going to be a rock and roll star. And at 3 years sober, I went back to school. But well, I mean, that's a big part of my story in a way. But I guess the point I'm trying to start by making is that getting sober and taking these simple steps in terms of living just one day at a time, but more importantly, sort of living in a moral way and a sort of sensible way, rather than the sort of like, I'm going to become a rock star, I'm going to become enlightened, I'm going to have this big revelation. Just like, oh, get a job, go to work, you know
Mhm.
uh, figure out how to be in a relationship that's not just about satisfying myself.
Mhm.
So all of this was like, starting life over. It was like, being a child almost, and because of how deluded I was about how life worked. And again, I don't see myself as unique in that way. Many of us in recovery, we have to kind of restart our lives. and so as I say, then I came to realize, oh, I have a job now, but if I went to school, I could get a better job, and obviously by then I'm kind of moving away from being a musician, although I kept, playing for some years professionally. But so there was this, growth, which then, I had kind of put Buddhism to the side. I hadn't put it away, but I kind of saw it as like, well, that didn't fix me. So I love it, but
Yeah.
I got to do these 12 steps. And then there's this God thing and this inventory thing. And I don't see that. I can't see that with Buddhism. So I'll just keep them separate, but I'll
Mhm.
just keep doing them both.
Right.
But at a certain point, at about 6 years sober, as I got further into my education, and I got sober in LA, and at that point I had gotten into UC Berkeley for
Mhm.
my upper division work, and so I moved to the Bay Area, which of course is a big hotbed of Buddhism.
Mhm.
And I started to, two things happened. Was one, I started to get more back into Buddhism, more committed to it,
Mhm.
and I also started to kind of hit that wall, that spiritual wall. And I talk about this a fair amount in my teaching as well, that I think a lot of people hit in recovery, where in the beginning they work the 12 steps. I mean, that's my path, but whatever path you're taking, at the beginning you're just doing what people tell you to do. you
Right.
know you
Yeah.
just because you realize, like, my decision making was got what got me here. I need some other guidance, and you just do what they tell you, and that's great, and your life changes and everything gets better. But at a certain point, as you become more integrated and more grounded, and you start to be able to kind of handle your own life,
Mhm.
some of the things that people told you start to not resonate so much anymore. So for me, the language of the steps started to become more uncomfortable. I wasn't so willing to just do what it said. And at that point, I started to really think about, well, can I do this with a Buddhist, view, through this lens of Buddhism? Now that was, the early 90s.
Mhm.
And I didn't write my book for a decade after that.
Ah,
My
right.
first book, which was kind of the breakthrough. So there was a lot that happened in there, besides, and life. I mean, during that time, I, you know, wound up going to graduate school, getting a master's in creative writing and writing novels, and thinking, and sort of getting like, oh, novels are going to fix me, and that didn't happen. And getting married, and having a daughter, and but also during that time in the 97, I got invited into a teacher training program, a Buddhist teacher training program, and that's when I started to I started to teach then. And the funny thing was that early in my teaching, I found recovery stuff starting to slip in to my talks.
Mhm.
And at first I felt like, "Oh, people aren't gonna wanna hear that." Like,
Right.
this is because I'm like this weird person, I'm thinking,
Mhm.
typical, addict, like, I'm unique, nobody's like me.
Right. Right.
And, instead, people started to come up to me and say, "Hey, I'm in the program too. Could you talk more about that?"
Right.
I was like, "Wow, that's interesting. Okay." So I started to expand on it, and then I started to run into more people, who were similar to me, who had a interest in Buddhism, who were in recovery. And that's when I realized, oh, I'm not unique. And the things that I've been thinking about really need to be out there. I need to get these
Sure.
ideas out there. I, I, because for a long time, from early in recovery, I realized most people in the 12 step world do not know how to meditate. And
Yeah.
I used to teach people to meditate, or get them to go on retreats and stuff, early on. And
Mhm.
I started a meeting, uh, with a bunch of guy friends early in recovery, where we meditated for 20 minutes. And like, at no meeting did anybody meditate more. I remember people, they'd meditate for 5 minutes, and then they'd spend an hour and a half talking about how hard that was. know,
Right.
and so
Yeah.
I knew there was this need for what I had,
Mm.
but then realizing that, oh, it's not just the meditation, but it's really a lot of people struggle with the language and the concepts of the steps. And as I'm sorting this out, this is going to be something I'm going to need to share.
There's a obvious, real difference between the precepts of Buddhism and basic goodness. My kind of reading of it as being about kind of working with our flaws. What are the kinds of things that you saw that were needing reconciliation or needing some kind of further exploration between the two?
Well, the number one was, how do you turn your will and your life over to the care of God if you don't believe in God? I mean, and that became my second book, even
Right.
though I addressed it quite a bit in my first book. So, and it's something that comes up still to this day in my teaching. People come to me with that question. It's a lot, but if I can boil it down to the simplest idea, it's that I turn my will and my life over to the care of the Dharma. And
Mm,
the Dharma is the teachings of the Buddha, but it also just means truth. But it includes and contains this vast teaching, and so what this my second book, which is called A Burning Desire, Dharma, God, and the Path of Recovery. What it's about is teasing out the powers that are inherent to the Dharma and seeing them as things that you can turn your will and your life over to. So, some of the most obvious ones are things like mindfulness. If I turn my will and my life over to the care of mindfulness, it just means that I'm trying to be mindful and that I recognize that mindfulness is very powerful, and that indeed that awareness or the lack of awareness is very powerful. So if I'm not mindful, that is also powerful. So the turning it over, the positive turning it over is turning it over to the positive thing. And I realize that if I don't, that I'm off there in space, like just
right.
unconscious. And all the implications, because addiction is very much about unconsciousness. Uh,
Yeah.
Both being unconscious, we fall into it unconsciously, but we also foster unconsciousness. We try to become unconscious. So mindfulness is a great higher power. A loving kindness is a beautiful higher power. Turn my
Mm,
will and my life over to the care of love is a really interesting thing
mm,
to do, to view.
yeah.
Um, and much more. I mean, you look at the entire Eightfold Path, and each of them, if we look at them through this lens of higher power, we realize, oh, these things are powerful. You know, Intention is very powerful. Right speech is very powerful. All these things. So that's the gist of it.
Well, and as you're speaking, what I'm thinking of too is that it gets us into a realm of truth rather than our grandiose ideas and delusions. And there's a foundation there that we can keep coming back to, that we can rely on.
It's much more practical than some idea of, like, there might be something out there that I'm gonna ask if it'll help me to do stuff. It's actually
Right.
more empowering because, as I like to describe it, there's, the relationship with an external God is like, one a hierarchical relationship where there's this God up here and I'm down there. The
Right.
the relationship with the Dharma is more of a partnership. I
Right.
I'm choosing and I'm involved in that. It's not just that I'm helpless. It's that this thing is very powerful and I have a choice in how I relate to it. I can decide not to be loving, not to be mindful, not to speak wisely. That's my choice, right?
Right.
But and there are karmic effects of that. And by the
Right.
way, the law of karma is actually the higher power of Buddhism, if you look at it, because all these things are about cause and effect.
Right. Right.
What you do has a result. So it's very simple in a way, and yet it's very profound and powerful because uh, we know, like what we say about the 12-step program, it's a program of action. And we know that recovery is always, whether you're in the 12 steps or not, it's there's got to be this engagement. It's not, if it's passive, nobody that's what gives the lie to step 3 in a way that nobody says, "Oh, I turned my will and my life over to the care of God, and then I just stopped doing anything and
Right,
waited for God to fix things."
right.
It's just the
Uh-huh.
opposite.
Yeah,
It's much more about, because step 3 in the 12 steps is really more about acceptance than it is about God doing something. It's about us seeing, "Oh, I need to do my best, but then I need to let go of the results." It's when I get into this battle and try to control the world that it
right.
becomes a conflict. And when I can accept, okay, I did what I could, and now I'm gonna, oh, this is the direction I'm meant to go, rather than I don't want to go that way, I'm gonna go here, and fighting our whole lives against what's just happening naturally.
Mhm. And, when you were talking about at the beginning, we kind of take direction from people who've been around for a while. And in this, working with the Dharma, we have a much more engaged role in that. I mean, it's this big foundation of teachings and truth. And like you say, we can decide what we do there.
Yeah.
We're going to approach it. So you said something a bit ago about how your meditation really changed when you started into recovery. What do you mean by that?
One of the foundation principles of Buddhism, which is largely ignored in the West, is that following the precepts is the starting point of the path. Whereas
Mhm.
in the West, we think meditating is the starting point of the path.
Ah,
If you meditate and your life is a mess, or if you meditate and you're filled with greed or with anger, your meditation is not going to go very far.
right. Yeah.
And so getting sober was actually, if you know the term sila, the moral or ethical component of Buddhism, that was like establishing sila for the first time in my life. Really
Ah,
living in a skillful way, non-harming, not self-centered, not selfish. Uh, not I mean, using intoxicants is actually not using intoxicants is one of the precepts. So following the precepts and living that way created a foundation so that my meditation then really blossomed and went much deeper and was actually transformative in a way that it wasn't early on.
ah,
I got so I could sit still for a long time before I
mm,
got sober, but not much was happening in terms of actual transformation.
right. So my tradition is in the yoga meditation tradition, and we have the yamas and niyamas, which are similar as ethical precepts of non-harming and truthfulness and ways to work with ourselves and other people. And if we're not working with those, then nothing else really goes that well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. So when you're talking about this kind of almost deliberate unconsciousness that happens with addiction, why do you suppose that is? What are your reflections about why we do that?
I mean, not to be too simplistic, but we don't want to feel. You know, Addicts are afraid to feel, and we want to control how we feel. So that requires us to shut ourselves off from from what's going on, from reality. So
Right.
it's definitely that kind of escape. And there's a reason for that. I mean, there are reasons for that. There isn't a single reason for that. As we know, a lot of the sort of modern recovery research is pointing to trauma as one of the underlying causes of addiction, and
Mhm.
and that's certainly true in some cases. I don't know that I can point to that in my own case. For me, I think it's much more genetic.
Mhm.
But in any case, there's stuff going on that we don't want to feel. And so we try to find a way to turn it off. I remember one of my old friends in my early recovery talking about how toast was her first addiction, you know, just like eating toast when she was a little girl, and the stuffing yourself, stuffing your feelings.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's very much that. And a lot of my work in terms of how I teach meditation is about having people engage their feelings. Uh,
Wow.
I I don't really try to get people. I try. Well, I guess put it in a positive way. I point people away from just trying to stop their thoughts in
Mhm.
meditation. That that's not really an end point, and to show them, I, I I suggest to people that very often when their thoughts are really agitated and sort of continuous, where they're having a hard time breaking apart the thoughts, that what's going on is that there's something emotionally going on that they're not allowing to have space, which is, language that, it's the language of meditation is very often vague because there is no
Right.
real language for these nonverbal experiences. But so often, uh, people are like trying to do this thing, this dance between their breath and their thoughts. It's like, oh, I'm thinking, come back to my breath. Okay, in, out, in, out. Oh, my thinking again. And I'm like, no, you're just up here, go down here, go into your body, feel what's going on. And then you see like, oh, it's this sadness or this anxiety, this fear, or this anger, this energy that's in my body is actually the engine behind the thoughts, and so I have to sit with that. And then again, I often have to point out, like, we don't want to feel. Addicts don't want to feel. I mean, I think that's true of a lot of people, not just addicts, but that's my kind of population I work with a lot, and we're a little more extreme in that way, maybe. But we don't want to feel, and indeed we are afraid to feel. So it's not so easy when you say, "Oh, just go in there and feel." It's like, "Ooh, I don't know." So just to kind of gently suggest to people, okay, breathe, feel, see if you can take a breath and just let it be there and trust that it's just energy. Try to feel emotions as energy or as things that are in flow rather than as blocks of,
Mhm.
just cinder blocks that are stuck in your body, So this, um, so recognizing that feelings are impermanent, as everything is impermanent, but just feeling the impermanent nature of them can give you the confidence to then go into that and feel that. So I sort of took you there, took you somewhere
Yeah,
extra there.
that's great. That's great.
Really important place for me.
It is. Just what you said about in your mind going, "Oh, I'm in and out, in and out, in and out, I'm watching my breathing," is so different from actually feeling your breath in your body. That's a
Yeah.
huge difference there.
Well, and so if you go to the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the four foundations of mindfulness, it's the key teaching the Buddha gave. I was just reading a little of it to one of my classes the other day. How it starts out, and the Buddha just says, "Notice with your if your breath, if you have a short breath or you have a long breath, and just very simple." And we infer from that that he means just notice the different qualities of the breath, not just whether it's long or short, but just the way it feels. But very quickly, then he says, notice the whole breath. Notice the breath in the body, the whole breath. There's a phrase, the body of breath, and
Mhm.
it's one of those phrases that's been actually debated by scholars for a long time. Well, what does that mean? But we can take it. He's saying body and he's saying breath. So it's like, it's not just breath, it's like the whole body. And then he talks about calming the whole body with the breath. So we can see that a mindfulness of breathing is not just mindfulness of breathing, that it's really feeling the breath through the whole body, which again is very, not again, but is very connected to yoga, because obviously
Right,
the way that yoga uses the breath is much more than like, oh, I'm just feeling my breath. It's the breath
right.
through the whole body and the way it affects the whole body. And
Mhm.
yesterday or the night before last, I had a back spasm, and one of those things that I've had periodically over the last 25 years, and it was a bad one where I really froze up,
Mhm.
and I just once I kind of got like, okay, you got to relax because it's there's that panic at first.
Yeah, yeah.
Although I'm sort of used to it now, but then it was about, can I want to breathe into my lower back.
Mhm.
I have to soften and breathe into my lower back, and it's like my breath doesn't the air doesn't go into my lower back,
Right.
but as I'm mindful of my body, I see that, yeah, my lower back, softens and expands as I breathe in, and so that kind of connecting, can is so valuable, seeing how the breath is throughout the body.
Mhm. Well, one thing that I love is the recent research around the nervous system and how, even like 80% of the signals between the brain and the head and the body come from the body up to the brain, from the gut and the heart. And we can't really be present with ourselves unless we're in our body. And then how do we get to that? And I guess this is a question too. How do we get to that point of safety where it's safe enough to be in our body, and then we're still gonna keep zipping up into our head probably a lot of the time. So how do you encourage people to work with that, especially in the beginning?
Yeah. Well, I will say, first of all, I'll say that I'll most of my work isn't so much geared toward a newcomer in recovery.
Mhm,
Uh, so, uh, and although plenty of newcomers do come,
mhm,
but generally I'm not trying to sort of point my work towards, okay, you just came in the door, and how do you deal with this?
mhm.
Nonetheless, I have been, asked to do that, and I have actually, I used to work regularly at a treatment center, and so
Uh,
I can do that. I mean, the simplest thing to start by saying is that you you keep it simple to begin with, and uh, in terms of my working with people, but also kind of how I see it for people is it has to be very uh, individualized. Like there are people who get sober and they've actually got a background in meditation and they can kind of move into that. Then there are other people who have never been in their body. They have never even visited their body, and it's actually a dangerous place because of abuse they've had, particularly. And in that, then, I mean, first of all, I'm not a therapist, and when I sense that somebody has, or if they let me know that they are a trauma survivor, I don't so much try to push them to do this work solely. I definitely say you need to work with a trauma skilled therapist who's going to help you to do this. But nonetheless, my understanding is that if we are careful, we can gradually integrate those experiences and that mindfulness actually is the way you do it. And it's very interesting that there's this sort of two sides of this question around mindfulness, that on the one hand we see it as a tool for dealing with trauma, because it helps you. From my understanding is that a big part of healing trauma is to allow it to become integrated into your conscious mind, bring it out of the unconscious, and that you do that largely through that there's a body or bodily opening that has to happen in that, because very often the trauma is, maybe not very often, maybe always, is implicated in the body. It is
mhm,
held in the body. So mindfulness of the body is an obvious sort of tool for doing that. On the other hand, from some of the things that I've read about this, for people who it can be risky for people to just kind of go in there,
right.
and so one of the things that just simplest instruction that I give in my meditation instruction is if you when I say you can close your eyes, I now also say, if you're not comfortable closing your eyes, just sit with your eyes open, because that seems to be one of the easiest ways to kind of break the trauma impulse, or not impulse, but
Mhm. That
that
process that's going on. Yeah.
yeah, that trigger.
Yeah.
Um, but this idea of titrating, where you're just a little bit, you let in a little bit of that stuff, and you breathe with it. So, it's a question of sort of taking a little bit at a time,
Mhm.
uh, and because I know that like you can go on a meditation retreat and get very deep,
Right.
and but if you have trauma that's not integrated, that's going to that can just explode out of there. So
Mhm.
better to like sit with in a group or sit alone, try 5 minutes, see how that feels. Try 10 minutes, see how that feels. If things are coming up, be working with your therapist around that. It just seems like it needs to be done with a lot of care and
Right.
guidance.
Right. Yeah, for sure. What's your sense of 12-step groups like AA, for instance? Do you feel that they're getting more trauma informed? Lots of people have been talking about that over the last few years.
I don't go to many meetings these days, I confess. Oddly enough. I mean, because I'm really immersed in the steps. My newest book, which is going to come out, I hope, in January. Uh,
Oh.
it's a daily reflections, and it's a step of the month. So I go through the 12 steps on a
Mhm.
day with daily reflections. So I think about the steps all the time, but in terms of my own life, uh, I just don't. Meetings aren't really like a big part of it. So I hear things.
Mhm.
So I don't know. What is that? What you've heard?
Well, I've heard that it depends on the group and the people that are in the group. Some of the groups are much more trauma informed. Some are very resistant. It's like this has no place in it.
Yeah.
Um, so I
Well,
think
it's
there's
kind of
probably a pretty big range.
it's like the same thing as antidepressants. At one time, it was like, "Oh, if you're taking an antidepressant, you're not sober." And that's what people were taking 'em going, "This is not h I'm not high," I can
Right.
tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's become accepted. But, I mean, that is one of the I don't know if it's a good thing, but it's certainly one of the things about the program. Every group is, independent, there
Right.
isn't some, uh, rule book other than the 12 traditions.
Right.
And so, yeah, people kind of do it the way they want to do it. Talk about
Mhm.
what they want to talk about. I mean, I'm in the Bay Area, so the meetings I've gone to here, it's pretty liberal, shall we say?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, people still talk about God, but no. Yeah, I'm not the best authority on what's happening in
Right.
AA these days. I'm
And I
much
think
more sort of engaged in sort of Buddhist recovery, obviously.
right. Right. So do you feel like in Buddhist recovery, there's more of a trauma-informed
Oh,
approach? It sounds like
oh,
you
yeah.
are. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And I mean, and even, Buddhist recovery is a very generic term
Yeah.
that, but it's taken, there's a few different sort of forms and approaches people take, but uh, it's clearly very progressive and looking towards, uh, those kind of what are the cutting edge ideas around addiction. Uh,
Right. Right.
yeah.
Mm. One of the things that draws me to your work too is the loving kindness and what you call living kindness. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what's the point of doing all of this if we're not going to enjoy our life anyway? So
uh,
that's part of it. But how do you work with that, and how do you bring that in?
mm. Well, before I wrote, and that's one of my book titles too,
Right.
Living Kindness, which I'll talk a little bit about what that was, but why it's called that, but which might be obvious, but there's actually more to it. before that book, I wrote a book called Recovering Joy, which is even more specifically about, well, if if we're not having fun, why are we bothering to do this?
Right. Right.
So yeah, it's a really important issue. There, you know, and, and I see my work and my writing particularly as kind of responses to things that I've seen in the world of where I'm teaching and in the recovery world, the greater recovery world. I saw, okay, there's a need for this Buddhism and the 12 steps. And then I saw like, oh, people really have a hard time with this higher power idea. And then my third book was a workbook because people kept saying, well, how do I do this? So it was,
Mhm.
give me tools. But then I remember a particular retreat I taught at Omega Institute, actually. And it was like it felt really deep. It was 5 days or doing a lot of work, and I felt like, wow, people are really getting a lot out of this, but at the end of it, it felt heavy. I thought,
Mm.
well, they're missing, like, the key thing of, like, you need to be happy, you wanna be happy, right?
Right.
Um, but living kindness, which isn't, it's the one book that isn't, uh, specifically recovery oriented, although obviously it has implications, of that. Well, it's really a response to my feeling that the in this Buddhist teaching around loving kindness had become kind of uh, too narrowly defined. That it's become like it's just a meditation process, and it's a thing to just make me like feel like I'm loving, as opposed
Okay.
to actually being loving, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like my heart is wide open. Like get out of my way, That and so thus living kindness, are you really living this? It's not just a feeling, loving kindness. The Buddha didn't teach loving kindness as, oh, I want you to all feel loving. It was about action. And a lot of what I get in there, I pulled out a few kind of key suttas, the early teachings, where the Buddha talks more about non-hatred than about, positive love.
Mhm.
And so one of the points I like to make to people is, if you can just not hate anything, that's really good. And and it
Right.
kind of throws it back on people for them to realize, oh right, like even when I think I've got all this loving kindness going, there's still this like category of things and people and
Mhm.
politics or whatever that I'm like, I've got all these resentments, but I'm loving, so I'm okay, and it's like,
Mhm.
no, like turn towards the negative stuff. If you can let go of the negative stuff, the positive stuff will take care of itself. So there's this famously, there's a sutta called Simile of the Saw, where the Buddha says, even if bandits are sawing off your limbs one by one with a two-handled saw, if a thought of ill will arises in your mind, you are not practicing what I teach.
Oh, wow.
Well, that's a pretty high bar.
The
Even if
high
somebody
bar.
is sawing off my limbs, and it's not, I don't think we're meant to take it literally so much, although it occurred to me at a certain point that that's a really good description of Christ on the cross, you know, that he's still, even though people are like stabbing him and hammering it, nailing his hands in, he's still, forgiving of them, right?
Right.
So it's an image that's not just Buddhist in a way, but the point again is, okay, I'm not going to probably get there, but
Right.
it really points to what this is about and the challenge inherent in that. Um, and I think it is very relevant for addicts because addiction has this tremendously aversive and negative energy to it. You know, even though there's sort of this idea like, oh, I'm trying to get high. So much of it is like, I just don't want to feel. You know,
Right.
And when you look at the AA Big Book, they say, resentments are the number one enemy. So clearly, and writing an inventory, it's all about like dealing with that side of us that
Right,
gets triggered into hatred and aversion and anger. And that just letting go of that is really freeing. And and yeah, I think that rather than, oh, I'm gonna generate all this love, if I let go of my hate, I'm gonna find that I'm actually very happy and peaceful and probably loving as well, just natural.
right,
Because, I think you referred to it at the very beginning about basic goodness.
right,
We don't have to create that.
right. It's there
We don't
already.
really have to create love in ourselves.
Right.
You see it. I mean, we feel it ourselves when we just, we stop feeling angry. There's a warmth and a natural caring that arises.
Hmm. I bet you've been working with that a lot this year with COVID and the Black Lives Matter after George Floyd was murdered and the election. So
Yeah.
what are you seeing? Are you finding that people are I agree with what you just said because I think when we have a lot of distractions, a lot of habits of the mind, need for control, fear distract us from knowing our own goodness and other people's.
Yeah.
So what are you finding in the people that you're working with? Is it I suspect it's a struggle.
I'm not sure that I know what's happening with people.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I On March 13th, that was the first time that Spirit Rock, which is my kind of home meditation center, um, canceled my class
Mhm.
because of the pandemic. And I immediately started to teach on Zoom. I started that night. It was like maybe they canceled a couple days before, but that was my first night. And that this ever since then, every Tuesday morning and every Friday evening, I've taught an hour-long class. And mentioned that it's an hour long because that's actually critical to, like, how I get through it, because
Okay.
it's short enough. I We do 20 minutes of meditation, and then I talk, and I've been actually taking people through my book, one breath at a time, with a lot of side trips.
Mhm.
But what I'm getting at is that I don't hear from people that much.
Okay.
I mostly do the talking, and when
Mhm.
I open it up, it's more about, like, oh, meditation practice, and I guess, one of my kind of guiding principles as a teacher is that if I'm feeling something, there must be a whole lot of other people feeling it. If I've
Right.
experienced something, it's not unique. I'm not unique. So I kind of that's why I teach out of my own experience, but not with the idea that, oh, isn't my experience interesting and unique, but
Right.
rather I'm just a generic human being.
Yeah.
So, I just feel like I'm not sure people wanna talk that much about what they're going through, they just wanna, like, I think they come to me for a respite
Right.
and a refuge rather
Mhm.
than, "Oh, I wanna come to you and process it." I think maybe they'd be more likely in a meeting, in a 12-step meeting, to be processing it.
Oh, okay.
Uh,
Right.
but with me, I think it's much more like they come to me for some soothing, you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
uh, and some guidance. And I share about what I'm going through and you know,
Mhm.
and my view of what's happening because I don't feel like I have to ask them that much. I sense that
Right.
we're kind of going through this together, and you know, uh, so yeah,
I think it's really helpful to know that we're not the only ones. So when a teacher especially could say, "Yeah, I'm struggling with this. My mind is going here. I'm not sleeping as well," whatever it might be.
yeah.
It's helpful for just to normalize the responses people have. Yeah.
That's one of my guiding principles, and it really goes back to my early practice in which I felt that my teachers were sort of these m- models of
Mhm.
perfection that I couldn't live up to.
Uh,
And that was that's kind of the Asian model of teaching, which is
mhm,
that you kind of represent the Buddha and you should just act like a Buddha when you're teaching.
mhm.
but for somebody with low self-esteem or whatever, who comes in, that then you feel less than. And so
Right.
I've always had, this feeling as a teacher that I didn't want people to feel less than. I
Mhm.
wanted them to see that we're not different. I'm just maybe a little further along the same path, but, uh, that it
Mhm.
so, like, for instance, yesterday morning, having had this, back spasming,
Right.
I just g my talk was on working with pain,
Mhm.
and, that I got a lot of I did get several people giving feedback, one person saying, "Wow, like, I'm about to have knee surgery, and that was really helpful, the way you talked about that."
Right.
'Cause, I've worked with pain and chronic pain as well as, mm, a pain just in sitting meditation, and it's
Mhm.
something that I've thought about a whole lot, and,
Mhm.
yeah, and that's just an example too of that I usually teach out of what's happening for me right now.
Right.
So
Right.
so yeah, I taught a class on election day at
Right.
10 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
That was intense.
Yeah.
And then the Friday night, which was the day before they called the election.
Right.
Uh, yeah, I feel like, yeah, I'm somehow sort of this, I don't know, a guinea pig out there, like, "Oh, I'm just going through everything you're going through,"
Right.
and trying to talk about my process of that, and hopefully that my process is maybe a little more evolved or, includes a deeper dharma understanding that I can kinda bring people along with me.
Right.
So I actually the night before they called the election when things were still really kinda challenging, but it felt like, okay, it's gonna be okay, but we still weren't sure. I
Right.
talked about refuge and about that ultimately who the president isn't what really is the most important thing in my life because refuge is something that's outside of history and outside of time.
Mhm.
So it's outside of politics and all that. When you take refuge in the Dharma and the Buddha and the Sangha, you're saying these are timeless protections
Right.
that go beyond the vicissitudes of
Right.
our world. Yeah.
Right. And the I don't know if it's an ability exactly, but the ability or to be able to take refuge or to to relax your back and breathe when there's a spasm. It's like that little meme sometimes you see about whoever calmed down when you were told to calm down. Nobody, it's like, calm down. Well, that's not going to work.
Right.
And so we have this wish though, and this desire and this inspiration to be more connected inside with ourself and with the Dharma and with each other. And so again, I guess that before we finish, I'm going to come back around to the question of joy. So what's your joy right now in your life? How does that unfold for you right now?
Hmm. It's definitely really important uh, to intentionally do things that uh, are just light and don't have any import. My uh, regular activity, which is not necessarily joyful always, but which takes me out of the ordinary daily grind, if you will, is golf, actually,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
which is an odd thing, especially for like a Berkeley Buddhist. It sort of seems like culturally wrong,
Yeah.
and it took me a while of. So I played golf when I was a kid, and I loved it. And then when I became a poor musician and a hippie, it was like it went against my values and my economics.
Right, right.
But I took a course called Awakening Joy with my teacher,
Mhm,
James Barris,
mhm.
uh, 10 or 12 years ago, and it came up that I wanted to do it, and I was like, "Okay." And there's a self-consciousness around it because of the association with,
Right.
wealth, and, I mean, even our, soon to be ex-president, it's like,
Disc golfing.
but
Yeah.
it turns out, oh, there's a lot of, like, local golf courses you can play for $20, and you get
Uh,
some cheap clubs, and, oh, it doesn't mean you don't have to be rich, and,
mm,
so because when I'm on a golf course, it's like I'm in a separate world. I actually have tried to put together some material around mindful golf, but actually golf as a hero's journey.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
Anyway, it's a world like when I'm there, there's just nothing else. I don't think
Right.
about anything else when I'm there. And
Yeah.
so and it's really interesting during the pandemic, the golf industry is booming. Every golf course is packed all the time. I used to be able to just go to the golf course and say, "Oh, I want to play now." There's go ahead. Now you've got to book it a week ahead of time because it's a perfect pandemic activity.
It is. You can be outside, you can still be with people. It's
Yeah,
relaxing. Yeah.
but I mean that's very specific. I mean, I think the more general point is to find something that doesn't have any meaning or purpose. It's hard, especially if you're ambitious to just say, I'm just going to pick up a guitar and try to learn to play a chord. Well, I play the guitar. So, you know,
Right.
I, I pick up my guitar. That's another thing I do. It doesn't have any purpose right now. I mean, it used to, uh,
Right.
but, uh, or, I'm just going to watch the silliest movie I can watch. I mean, I was watching a really silly movie last night. I can't get my wife to go along on that one.
Oh,
She wants to watch something more intense drama, which is great, but
right.
and and frankly, my daily joy is watching TV with my wife at night. We set aside time. She's a very hardworking English professor, uh, and I'm kind of working more than I want to be working too. And so nighttime comes, we always set aside like 2 hours that we'll just kick back, and you know, it's pretty American and simple, but it's that thing of turning the world off.
Mhm. Right.
And then I'll just say, like, for me, like, I have to remember to go outside, you know, just
Right.
going outside
Yeah.
and like our dog died, I guess,
Oh,
early
okay.
in the pandemic,
Yeah.
and I had a walk that I was responsible for walking him every morning, and there was a walk that I would take with him. A few months after he died, I realized I need to go just take that walk. So
Right.
nowadays, I usually just take the walk, the Nicky walk,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
in the morning. Oh, say hi to some neighbors, look at the sky.
Get some chair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just that idea of doing something that doesn't have any. I'm not going to the gym to try to get in shape, or we're such a driven culture.
Yeah.
Everything has to have a purpose. You can't do something just for no reason. I mean,
Right.
that's why, like, I don't gamble on the golf course either. Like, people playing golf and they're like, "Okay, how much are we playing for?" I'm like, "I'm not playing for anything." Like, I came here to get away from the challenge. I mean, it's a challenge. I play against myself,
Yeah.
but
Right.
that's what I enjoy. I'm not doing it
Right. You're not
anyway.
doing
I don't know if that answers your question really.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I
I
think it
think,
does. There's something beautiful about putting aside that push energy and that competitiveness and just doing something for the pleasure of doing it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think we can find joy in everything.
Mhm.
We can find joy in our work, and I don't like to say should, but in this case, I'll say we should try to find joy in our work. If we're not, then I mean, obviously, there's times it's like this is just the job you have to have because you just got to get by. But if possible, if you have a career, you have some control over it. To find a way to find joy in your work and purpose in your work and joy in your recovery. I mean, recovery. again, happy, joyous, and free, is the
Mm.
expression. It's not like, oh, I got to go to another meeting to grind.
Right,
Yeah, it's finding the joy more than it is, oh, it
right,
has to be a special activity, right?
right. Yeah.
And that again, I think is a challenge for us because we don't think. Uh, I mean, it's partly how we define joy. You
Mhm.
know, like joy or happiness. I defined it as being in a good mood, and I
Ah,
came to realize that that's not what happiness is.
right.
Happiness is having an integrated life that has meaning and purpose for you, and
Mm,
that's got balance. And there's
mhm.
going to be lots of times when you're not in a good mood, but that
Right.
doesn't mean you're unhappy.
Yeah.
That was kind of like one of my critical kind of points in my book, Recovering Joy. That even when I've struggled with depression in recovery, I didn't think I was unhappy. That I was just my mood was painful, but happiness is something broader than that. You know,
Right.
I'm happy because I have a great partner, I have a great daughter, I have a great teaching job that I do, that I have a good
Mhm.
life. That's what happiness to me is. So so those 2 different things, like the trying to find joy, like in the golf, but I know one day might not be able to play golf at all anymore. Does that
Right.
mean
Right.
that I'm not happy anymore? Um,
Right.
it's sort of an
Yeah.
existential.
Yeah. And I also think that, the fulfillment and meaning that you have in your life and your work, um, that's something that I really feel too. I feel really of use in the world
Mm,
and of benefit, and that makes a lot of difference.
yeah.
So there's a sense of fulfillment in that. Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, that's what step 12 and the 12 steps is pointing to.
Mm,
Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message, and that we've come to understand that that's talking beyond just the idea of, oh, sponsoring people, or but it's about service and realizing, because the kind of the heart of spiritual awakening is realizing that striving for self-satisfaction is a fruitless and vain activity,
mm,
that actual happiness comes from being of service. And that's because, in Buddhist terms, the self is just a construction anyway, so it can't really be satisfied. And that, and so the natural response to that insight is to reach out to help others to have the same insight, to find the same freedom. And
mm,
so when we think of our work and when we make our work service, then we are letting go of self and
right.
self-centeredness. Yeah,
Mm. That looks like a good place to finish.
yeah,
Why don't you tell people though how they can get a hold of you? What is your
yeah.
website? What are the best places?
Yeah, my website is kevingriffin.net. If you Google Kevin Griffin, you usually get either me or the lead guitar player for Better Than Ezra at the top of that list. So we've competed for the top spot. Um, and you can email me through there. I have
Yeah.
my teaching schedule on there. As I said, I've got regular right now Zoom classes Tuesday morning and Friday evening, and the link for that is all on my website. There's an audio version of One Breath at a Time on Audible as
Yeah,
well.
I listened to that this morning.
Yeah, I did that myself. So um,
I think that's important when it's a meditation book that the meditation teacher does the audio. So
yeah,
I was pleased to see that you did that yourself. There's something about your voice that brings you to a different place than a narrator would.
yeah, oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, for
And your
sure.
new book is coming out by the time this airs in January.
Oh,
This
good. So that's just going to be. I think it's just going to be called Buddhism in the 12 Steps Daily Reflections.
okay.
I'm learning to keep my book titles very simple
Okay.
and and just tell people what they are.
But
So
there. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and doing this, and I really appreciate your work and your time. It's been wonderful to talk with you.
thank you, Lynn. It's a joy, really,
Yeah.
truly, really nice to meet you and
You too.
speak with you.
Yeah.
Uh,
Welcome to the 2021 Radical Recovery Summit, presented by the Kiloby Center for Recovery. This is Lynn Fraser, your moderator. This year, our theme is Feel It, Heal It, a new paradigm of recovery, featuring a diverse group of thought leaders and innovators, people who are working on the ground in the new field of addiction recovery. Go to radicalrecoverysummit.com to sign up and watch free.